Welcome to Ask an Economist. I'm Matt Grudnoff.
And I'm Richard Dennis.
And we're economists.
We're here to answer your questions, and you can send them in to us as an email or a voice memo to mail@australiainstitute.org.au with Ask an Economist in the subject line.
On today's episode, we're going to answer questions on wages growth. We're going to answer questions about unemployment benefits and whether or not Australia has an epidemic of lazy workers. And we're going to have a look at stimulus and whether or not JobKeeper should be withdrawn at the end of March.
All right, well, let's get to the questions.
So our first question is wage growth good or bad? Why does the RBA always talk about wage growth at the moment, but the government doesn't?
Well, wages are weird. Wages are both the main source of income in the economy, so most people get most of their money from what their boss pays them, their wages. But wages aren't just the main source of income, they're also an expense for business. So we hear all the time about are wages, too high or too low. Just entirely depends on who you ask. Most bosses would prefer to pay their workers less money, but most bosses would prefer their customers to have more money, because the only reason people can afford to buy things is because they're spending the income they earn from their wages. So when we talk about the economy and are wages good or bad, or high wages good or bad, we don't have a simple answer about what's right, but we do have simple answers about what's wrong. And when you have really low wage growth, like we've had in Australia for years, we've got record low wages, what that means is people's incomes haven't been rising, they haven't been spending much money, and in turn, the people who make things and sell things are having a lot of trouble profitably making things and selling things. So the Reserve Bank of Australia keeps saying we need to get wage growth up in Australia. And unfortunately, we have the loudest voices in the Australian economic debate, the Business Council of Australia, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, all the employer groups are always saying, no, we have to keep wages low.
So basically, a business wants to keep its own wages down, but wants to keep everybody else's wages up.
Exactly. So the most profitable business you can have is one where you keep paying your workers less and less, but all of your customers are getting big pay rises. And when we talk about things at the economy-wide level, of course that's ridiculous. But if we're going to have sustained economic growth, we're going to need to see wages begin to grow. And of course, every year the government, when it puts out its budget, it has all these forecasts in the budget papers for wage growth that never eventuate. And it's not a surprise, because every time the public sector workers ask for a wage rise, the government says, no, you can't have one. And every time people say we should increase the minimum wage, the government says, oh, that might be a bit hasty. So you can't get wage growth in the economy if you don't give people pay rises. And we've got policies in place that keep putting downward pressure on wages. And now we live in an economy with very low wage growth. We had one before the crisis, and it's still there now.
So Richard, what should wage growth be?
Well, according to the Reserve Bank, wage growth should start with the 3 point something. Historically, that's what wage growth was, and it's been a long time since we've seen that. So
why 3 point something?
Well, because it's smaller than 4 and bigger than 2, and you know what economics is like, Matt. Look, I think what we're really hearing the RBA say is we need to get back to the kind of wage growth that we saw in the 80s and 90s, and we're a long way from that at the moment. And the Reserve Bank is saying if we don't get wages growing, we're not going to get the economy growing.
All right, shall we move on to our next question? There's lots of talk about increasing the rate of JobSeeker. Is there a chance a higher rate of JobSeeker will mean people won't take a job?
Right. So, let's first, JobSeeker is the payment that we give people who are unemployed and are eligible for what we used to call unemployment benefits, or the dole. We keep changing the names of things, which doesn't help. So JobSeeker is the payment that people who are unemployed are eligible for, and it's stingy. Australia has one of the lowest the lowest unemployment benefit in the developed world, and this is not an accident. We've kept it low by design for decades, and the consequence of that is that someone who loses their job when the car industry moves offshore, when the restaurant they work in goes broke,
Or the pandemic shuts
Or
the
the
retail place that you work at.
Shuts down, the whole sector. People who were earning 80,000, 60,000, 50,000 or minimum wage of around 40,000 see their income fall to this very, very low unemployment benefit. Now, the question is, if we pay people more money, might they not just kind of be lazy and sit around and prefer to be unemployed and rake it in? And of course,
that's what we hear from the government all the time. We hear them saying that, we'd love to pay the unemployed more, we'd like to be more generous, but basically we can't, because if we do, they'll just sit at home all day and they won't try and get a job.
Oh, and we actually had the Deputy Prime Minister saying the problem is people are sitting around in inner city. It's always the inner city people when the National
Which is where the unemployment rate is lowest.
Low unemployment rate in the city, and the Deputy Prime Minister thinks they're all spending too much time on Netflix because the unemployment benefit was so generous they couldn't be bothered looking for a job. Well, let's be clear, the minimum wage in Australia, the minimum wage, if you're going to work 40 hours a week, is around $40,000. The unemployment benefit right now, after we just increased it, is, what are we up to?
$16,000
$16,000 a year. So you're more than double your income if you move from unemployment benefits to the lowest paid full-time job in the country. So the idea that the unemployment benefit can't be too generous, well, we're not even close to having that problem. But of course, the other point to make is we know in Australia today, the same people who measure unemployment measure job vacancies. The Australian Bureau of Statistics tells us that there's nearly 4 unemployed people for every job vacancy in Australia. So let's play out the kind of right-wing horror scenario of the 20-year-old lazy person who just can't be asked ever getting a job. In Australia today, if that person sits at home and watches Netflix all day, it's not like there's an employer that can't find anyone else to take the job. We know there's nearly 4 unemployed persons for every job that's going. But we're obsessed, we're terrified that there might be someone who's happy to be unemployed. Now, if the economy was booming and if there were not many job vacancies and 500,000 people sitting around watching Netflix, then I'd change my answer. But here we are in an economy with 900 or so thousand unemployed people, nearly 1 million people underemployed, 250,000 job vacancies, and a political class that's kind of terrified that someone might be happy to live on a very modest income and watch some telly.
Yeah, and I did a bit of research into this, and what I decided to do was look.
Are you suggesting I haven't?
I'm not suggesting that, though it is entirely possible. Now, basically, I had a look at all of the developed countries, all of the OECD countries, and I figured if the government's idea that, there's all these lazy people who would much prefer to stay at home if the unemployment benefit was higher, then countries that had more generous unemployment payments would have higher unemployment rates.
Well, that follows.
That follows, right? So what I did was I looked at all of the developed countries and I looked at their unemployment rates and how generous their unemployment benefits were. And you would expect that there would be a positive relationship between that. That is, the higher the unemployment benefit, the higher the unemployment rate.
The more lazy people sitting around sucking everybody else dry.
But what I actually found was the reverse. And there wasn't a strong correlation, but it was basically a slight correlation where we found that more generous countries with more generous unemployment benefits actually had lower unemployment rates, not higher unemployment rates.
So give us some examples.
Well, so for example, take Germany. Germany has an unemployment benefit that's basically twice ours. And they, before the pandemic, this is all data that the latest OECD data from 2019, they have an unemployment rate that was a full 2% lower than ours.
So they had more generous unemployment benefits and lower unemployment.
That's right. And the Netherlands was even worse. They had unemployment benefits 3 times as generous as ours, and their unemployment rate was just under 2% lower than ours.
So it's only Australian young people who binge on Netflix and...
Apparently.
It's amazing. I thought we were supposed to be proud of our country.
All right, let's have a look at another question. Our next question is, at the end of March, JobSeeker will come to an end. Is this the right time to end JobKeeper?
No, it's terrible.
Tell me what you really think, Richard.
So JobSeeker is the payment that we give people who are unemployed. JobKeeper is this wage subsidy that the government introduced in the middle of the beginning of the crisis. And JobKeeper was designed to transfer enormous amounts of public money into employers who'd seen their revenues fall. And quite explicitly, the idea was, we're going to give you money now so that you don't sack all of your staff. Now, the ACTU actually pushed for this idea. Initially, the government said it was crazy. They've implemented it, and it's worked. There are a lot of workplaces that hung on to their staff because JobKeeper effectively subsidised.
So essentially, business got free labour.
Business got free labour, and if they kept their labour on.
Yep.
So a lot of them did. So that was good. That was well-designed policy in the big picture. There's no doubt that too much JobKeeper went to some companies, and we've seen companies making record profits, paying huge bonuses to shareholders.
I suppose if your business is doing okay and suddenly the government gives you or pays your wages bill, then it's an easy way to make a profit.
Exactly. And while we're obsessed with targeting unemployment benefits at exactly the right people, and we're terrified that some of them might get $1 more than they deserve, we've been very loose with handing out JobKeeper. And
almost
look,
like it's an entirely different group.
It's like we're helping wealthy, powerful people or something. So we've shoveled an enormous amount of money to help them help their businesses to retain staff, and that's good. But now the government's saying, right, March is coming up, time to stop. Now, this is a very dangerous time to do this, because while the economy has been growing strongly, the economy is still smaller than it was a year ago. And huge parts of the economy are still struggling enormously, particularly the tourism industry. Huge parts of the accommodation and sort of restaurant and cafe industry are still struggling. A lot of regions are still struggling, and the government's going to pull out the JobKeeper payment, and inevitably the employers are going to lay off a large number of staff. So
there are currently a bunch of people who really have a job because the government's still paying JobKeeper.
Yep.
And if they get rid of JobKeeper, those bosses are going to go, well, look, we can't really afford you.
In a heartbeat. And we know this is going to happen. And economists know it. Economists are telling the government it. And the government's basically ignoring that advice and saying, oh, it's all right, we're going to subsidise some airfares and encourage people to fly.
To marginal seats.
To marginal seats. So the government is scrapping a generalised national scheme, and they're replacing it with some very small sectoral schemes right at the point in time where the economy is starting to recover. Now, taking all of that money out...
So I think JobKeeper's currently being paid at the moment at a rate of $5 billion a month.
Right. So pulling all of that money out, no longer injecting it in, is going to have huge consequences. The people who lose their jobs, they're going to lose confidence, they're going to go out for dinner less, they're going to buy less stuff in the shop. So I would suggest it's precisely the wrong time to completely withdraw JobKeeper. And I think what the government is just hoping is that the private sector is just going to start spending a lot of money at the same time the government withdraws public money. But hope is not a strategy.
Yeah, well, I mean, I heard Josh Frydenberg saying that he expects the next few months to be bumpy.
Bumpy?
Bumpy, yeah.
So that's economics for hundreds of thousands of people losing their jobs.
Yeah. And of course, the problem with in a recovery, if suddenly the unemployment rate goes up, is unemployed people spend a whole lot less than employed people. And so not only is suddenly the government withdrawing $5 billion a month out, but if we've suddenly got all these unemployed people, they're not spending as much in their local towns and cities, and so therefore the local shops aren't doing as well, and they may well then sack more staff, and you have this vicious circle. So ending JobKeeper in March, not a good idea. The recovery is very fragile, and withdrawing all of that stimulus right now is exactly the wrong time to be doing it.
Thanks for watching Ask an Economist.
If you've got a question, we'd love to hear from you.
Please send an email or a voice memo to mail@australiainstitute.org.au, and we have a go at answering it.